Thank you and good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking the Center for South Asia and the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice for inviting me to your lunch lecture series, and to Viren and Sarah for making it happen. Viren has already issued the brief clarification that I wanted to, because a lot of your posters showed me as University of Johannesburg, but I'm actually just a research affiliate there. I'm at the moment an independent scholar, and I needed to sort of clarify that because I don't want to pretend that I'm a full-time faculty member of the University of Johannesburg. Having got that off my chest, let me now turn to today's topic. It is 50 years since India experienced the emergency. We are commemorating 50 years of the Indian emergency, which was imposed on the 25th of June, 1975. And it's been considered a dark period, though some scholars of social justice challenge the term dark period. They see it differently. And I think after 50 years, we should have had sufficient critical distance to look at this period. I use the word should very deliberately because there are some who have not yet moved into that space for critical distance because it's still a very raw experience. It was a dark period when there was violence, when there were encounter killings, when there was torture, when people were picked up off the street. I'm talking about India. Picked up off the street and thrown into jail, and So lots has been written about it. There have been government reports, there have been journalistic accounts, there are memoirs, there are biographies, there are academic texts, there are films, there are anyone who was a South Asianist in the 70s felt they needed to write about it, so that you will find hundreds of articles in established journals on the event. But we felt when I was invited to put together a volume to commemorate 50 years, we felt we wanted to do something different. Now, when I begin by inviting all of you to revisit the emergency, and I make this an important point. It's an invitation to revisit. Now, why would I invite a community of social scientists to revisit? I mean, I obviously have something in mind, because I think if you revisit the emergency, it's not just an India story. It's not just an India event. I think if you revisit it with all the tools that have developed in the last 50 years, there's lots that you could learn. For example, and this is a question which speaks to you in the United States and speaks to other democracies. Today we are talking about backsliding of democracies. So why is it, for example, that all the checks and balances institutions that a constitutional order was supposed to have created, why did all the checks and balances institutions, and I mean oversight institutions, deliberative institutions, regulatory institutions, penalty awarding institutions, why is it that all the checks and balances institutions were so feeble to be unable to constrain a plebiscitary leader, and I'm using that in a very Weberian sense, a plebiscitary leader who had a desire to accumulate more and more power? Why was it they were unable to resist this? And we see that during the emergency. Another big question that concerns humanities and social scientists, especially those who are studying regions like South Asia, Africa, etc., is there was an old argument made in the late 60s, which unfortunately may have not got as much purchase as it should have, by Huntington of the Clash of Civilizations fame, that you needed, for countries emerging out of colonialism, you needed political order first before you opened it up to democratic participation. Now, that was dismissed as part of state, Department of State policy, and they wanted to control military regimes, etc. But the idea that if you had feeble institutions that now were open to demand overload, maybe those institutions wouldn't be able to cope. This is a question that, again, now this is an argument that was made for countries coming out of colonialism, but we are beginning to see that even in so-called mature democracies, institutions are not able to cope. At that time, the demand was from below. Now we're beginning to see a demand from above, and the institutions remain as feeble. A third set of issues, I'm just doing this as a kind of background setting to my specific talk, but in a sense also to justify why I feel so honored and privileged to speak to such a diverse community of scholars here. Why is it that when a country is trying to build its state structure, it's come out of colonialism, how much of the residues of colonialism must it live with? You know, there's the India model, there's the China model. What are the continuities and discontinuities? How do you transform? I mean, you know, the Indian transformation through democracy is referred to as the passive revolution. Do you require a passive revolution, or do you need a much more active revolution, a much more violent revolution? These are questions that come to mind. And so when we began to think about all these questions, we felt we had a project, and we therefore published this book. I'll say something about the book before I really get down to the theme of today's topic. I still have 35 minutes. Because of the vast amount of material on the emergency, we felt we needed to approach the topic with three objectives in mind. The first objective is to take the themes that are already being discussed, like the case of the ADM Jabalpur, where the Supreme Court suspended the writ of habeas corpus. You know, there are resonances, right? Or the issue of coercive laws, which still remain on the statute books. So we took existing themes and we've opened them up in the book. We've also identified a series of under-theorized themes which have been flagged in the literature, but not sufficiently looked at, like the foreign hand. You know, is there, in international politics and geopolitics, is there a foreign hand that is interfering with domestic politics? Not in the obvious way that you see today, but through your covert organizations. Jeffrey Sachs lists something like 90 attempts by intelligence agencies to change regimes. How does one look at the economic crisis of the 70s and what would it do to government? Then the questions are set. So we took under-theorized themes and we've asked people to revisit them and open them up. And then finally, we've identified new themes that were not discussed at the emergency. And I think this is also valuable for us here. Right? When I read your New York Review of Books or the London Review of Books, or I read thought journals, I'm fascinated by the way people are looking at the contemporary. I'm fascinated the way that how they're trying to negotiate, a kind of authoritarian tendency on the one hand and a desire for freedom on the other. You see that in theater, you see that in poetry. So we looked at poetry, and there's a whole chapter on poetry written during the emergency. We have looked at the jail experience. What does it mean, for people who are not in jail, who are on this side of the gates? There's always this feeling that, when you're on this side of the gates, you have citizen rights. But once the door's shut, you lose all your rights because then the jailer takes over. Is that true? And so we've looked at a case of the jail experience, which is a very tragic story of India's overcrowded jails, pending court cases, people not knowing why they are in, and most of them are poor, unlettered people coming from marginal groups. And then for the scholars of social justice, we have a chapter on the Dalit perspective on the emergency. I gather many of you are familiar with these concepts and regarding South Asia, but the Dalit who is a community that has always been oppressed by the dominant castes, oppressed at every level, not just in terms of cultural oppression, but also in terms of material oppression, in terms of indebtedness, in terms of the hawking of their utensils, etc., suddenly feel themselves liberated by the emergency because all these practices of oppression are outlawed by the emergency under something called the 20-point program. So there's a chapter which says, while the middle class may feel that this was a dark period because of the suspension of civil liberties and democratic rights in terms of negative liberty, the Dalit feels actually liberated because now positive liberty becomes much more tangible. So yes, so these are some of the issues that are there in the book, and I shall give the copy to the center. It should be there in your library, those of you who wish to consult it. Now, all this led me to, The third hat I wear, political scientist, editor of the book, is that of a contributor to the volume. And my own contribution is on which is the title of today's talk, why did Indira Gandhi impose the emergency, and why did she lift it? Now, why am I asking this question? I mean, I'm not a storyteller. It's not because I want to tell you a story which you don't know about. But I think because, first of all, having read the memoirs, having read the autobiography, the biographies, not autobiographies, the biographies of Indira Gandhi, having looked at, having studied democracy for 40 years, being a student of comparative democracy, I mean, I've accumulated a lot of trivia about democracies all over the world. So having reflected on that trivia, I'm simply astounded by the fact that a lot of the analysis of the emergency has not gone into the subjective world of the Prime Minister. I'm not interested in Indira Gandhi's subjective world in itself, but if the subjective world of a Prime Minister is under-theorized or not theorized at all, I think there's something missing in the analysis. Now, I can see all of you are thinking, oh, well, what about, how is he going to extrapolate this to the present, to different societies? We'll leave that for Q&A. But I think the subjective world of a Prime Minister, because even in a parliamentary democracy, the Prime Minister's office is the primary site of decision-making. The PMO, and in that sense, the person of the Prime Minister who, if the Prime Minister is a very powerful personality, drives policy, drives decision-making. So recentering the subjective dimension of an important leader like the Prime Minister, I think is important for us as social scientists to understand an event like the emergency, or understand a period like other democracies are facing. Because unless you understand how that important decision maker is perceiving the world, the perception of the world, you're not going to be able to understand why those decisions are made. So perception becomes important. Perception determines agency. Perception is constructed through a series of experiences, influences, ideological training, whatever. So I decided that we need to look at the subjective dimension of the Indian Prime Minister who imposed the emergency. Now, there are three questions I asked. Why did she impose it? What happened when she imposed it? And why did she lift it? Very simple, very clear. Most of the literature answers the second question. What happened after she imposed it? So, you get stories of torture, you get stories of civil liberties being suspended, you get stories of encounter killings and jail atrocities. You get stories of feeble courts. You get stories of party politics. You'll get a whole range of data, but the Prime Minister's world, the inner world of the Prime Minister, or the subjective world of the Prime Minister, is inadequately discussed. I say, okay, so if you ask these three questions, you get some answers. But if you ask the questions independently, why did she impose it? You'll get one set of answers. I don't go to the second question because there's so much literature on it. And why did she lift it? You'll get another set of things. Now, if you ask them independently, why did she impose it? Why did she lift it? You'd give certain, she imposed it because of the High Court judgment, the Supreme Court judgment. Why did she lift it? Because she thought she was going to win elections. The intelligence agencies told her she was going to win elections. You give those sort of simple answers. I believe if you ask two questions together, why did she impose it and why did she lift it? Because the two questions are related, the answers are different. And I'm going to try and give you the answers of asking these two questions. Because when you ask these two questions together, when she imposed it after consulting with her advisors. There were people, including her son, who played an active role in advising her to impose it. But when she lifted it, she didn't consult her advisors at all. It was a totally personal decision, which surprised them. They told her to continue the emergency. She lifted it. Now, this to me is an inconvenient fact, that unless you can explain why she lifted, if you go by the advisor theory, then she should not have lifted it. But so why did she lift it? Why did she disregard all that they were telling her we can handle the political fallout? But madam, continue. It's not an issue. And by then all the protests and all had died down. There was no threat to her office. Yet she lifted it. So I try and give an answer to these questions. And I say the way to do that is to construct the decision frame of the Prime Minister. Because the decision frame has all the elements which a Prime Minister who makes decisions has to now put together and arrive at a kind of aggregate position. So I break up the decision frame into two dimensions: an external set of factors and an internal set of factors. Now, please remember one thing: we're talking of 1975. Please keep in mind that in 1975, India was a very young republic, only 25 years old. Please keep in mind that it was an outlier in South Asia. Pakistan and Bangladesh, there had been a sort of huge violence between them, and Bangladesh went through two partitions. Sri Lanka was heading towards a civil war. Nepal itself was unsettled. So India was an outlier. Somehow its democracy was chugging along rather well. And she imposed the emergency, almost with a flip of a switch. And then with a flip of a switch, 21 months later, democracy was back. I mean, I'm not being trivial, but I think these are questions that we need to ask. So the set of external factors that the Prime Minister confronted, and this comes after a decade of the 1960s, when India was going through a major economic crisis. There was a huge food shortage. In fact, the economy was known as ship to mouth. American grain was arriving in India, and it was immediately being sent to people who were. So it was known as a ship to mouth economy. There was political turmoil. She had to break the political party. So in the back of that, the 1970s were a very turbulent period. 1971 was the war with Pakistan and the liberation of Bangladesh. 10 million refugees were housed in India. And I mean, to India's credit, all kind of a rather impoverished economy was looking after 10 million refugees. I mean, it didn't have the economic wherewithal to do so, but it did so. 90,000, when Pakistan capitulated, 90,000 prisoners of war were kept in camps, in military camps, before they could decide what to do with them. So let's just list some of the crises of the external dimension that Indira Gandhi had to confront. First, in the 73, 74, 72, 73, two failed monsoons. Now, you must please understand, a monsoon is in India, I'm sure you know that, is a very important event. That India was largely an agrarian economy, and it was dependent on the monsoon. And so irrigation facilities are not as widespread as they are today. So India is a much more resilient economy today. In the 1970s, it was a much more fragile economy. And so two failed monsoons placed huge crisis on the rural economy and therefore the urban economy. There was food insecurity, there was agrarian distress. So two failed monsoons. 1973, there was the oil shock. When OPEC was formed and OPEC raised the price 5 times and wiped out India's foreign exchange reserves. There was a railway strike for 20 days in the month of May, 1975. Again, go back to the 1970s, 70% of India's goods were carried by the railways. They were not carried by road. We didn't have the kind of road infrastructure that you have today, or you didn't have the kind of technologies of 20-ton trucks taking stuff around. It was carried by rail. And the people who called for the railway strike said that we will bring the nation to its knees, right? So 20 days, 60 to 70% of Indian goods were under threat. There was economic inflation combined with high unemployment. There were sanctions from the global community because of India's nuclear explosion of 1974. It was a hostile geopolitics, and the United States foreign policy establishment had never quite forgiven India for challenging the Seventh Fleet, which sailed into the Bay of Bengal to threaten the Indian military actions against the Pakistani army in the port of Chittagong, which was blockaded. So Nixon, who was president, and Henry Kissinger hated her guts. In fact, on record, they've gone to call her a bitch and a witch. So you can see there's a hostile geopolitics. There was the foreign hand. There was a sense of insecurity that Allende had gone. India's railway minister Mishra had been assassinated. Her intelligence agencies were saying Mujib is next going to go. So she said, inform Mujib. Mujib laughed and said, my people are not going to assassinate me. And lo and behold, a few months later, he and his family were killed. There was treachery within her own party. People in the party were already manipulating to try and take over her position if she left. There were the court judgments that were very, very interesting court judgments. We can discuss that in Q&A. And most of all, there was a very turbulent political period. Two of the leading people in the opposition, Jayaprakash Narayan, allegedly gave a call to the security forces to disobey the government, which the government saw as sedition. And Morarji Desai gave a call to the people in the opposition to gherao the Prime Minister's house and Parliament and not let her go in and out till she resigns. So she had to deal with these external factors, which in her mind she saw as an impending period of anarchy. The internal factors, the inner world. I'm adding all these up because I'm trying to say that unless you understand all this, she has to now arrive at a decision. The world is in turmoil. She sees it as a period of impending anarchy, and she now has to make sense of it and decide what to do. Her intellectual mentors are Gandhi, who believed in non-violence. In fact, he was such an important influence in her life that during the partition of India, he directed her to go to the refugee camps, and she did. So she was regularly providing assistance to refugees who were moving from West Pakistan to India. Rabindranath Tagore, she spent some time in Shanti Niketan at his university, and he actually was very fond of her, didn't want her to leave, but she left because she was a stubborn woman. And her father, Jawaharlal Nehru. This is important, and I really want those of you who are sort of following the line of argument. He spent 9 years in a British jail during the Indian freedom struggle, okay? Fighting for freedom. Now, why is this important? Because during this period when he's in jail, his wife is dying of tuberculosis. She's moving from sanatoria to sanatoria in India, in Switzerland, in France, etc. And the only one who can take care of her is her daughter, because the husband is in jail. Husband has to choose between family and nation, and he chooses the nation. 9 years in jail. I mean, apparently the British offered him a deal that you don't indulge in politics, and we'll let you free to look after your family. Now, this relationship, what kind of relationship should you have with this man? He's so egoistical that he goes to jail and ignores a wife who's dying. But no, she's a deep bond with the father, because not only is he her father, but he's also her intellectual mentor. He's writing to her. If you read the letters to his daughter, I mean, it's fascinating that he's explaining to her Einstein's theory of relativity. I mean, I was fascinated to read that in one of the letters he's saying, the concept of time-space. I mean, it took me 50 years to even know that concept. And here is this man writing to his daughter about the concept of time-space. Or he writes to her saying, Darwin's theory, if it's accepted, is going to be the death knell of religion. So, if you read those letters, and I would urge you to read them just for the pleasure of seeing how he's trying to explain this complex world to his young daughter. She was also a very lonely personality. Nehru's sisters, she didn't care for, who were living in the same family home, because they were dismissive of her. When she was a young girl becoming a teenager, she overheard one of them saying, she's such an ugly child. So I'm just trying to explain to what are the burdens she had to bring into her office. She had no friends except her husband. And incidentally, both Nehru and Gandhi did not want her to marry Feroz Gandhi. She married them against the advice of her father and Mahatma Gandhi. These are the elements that make up a subjective world, and psychologists have looked at it and has found her to be stubborn, courageous, firm-willed in the sense that her advisor telling her, please don't explode the nuclear bomb because you'll be faced with sanctions. She says, go ahead and explode it. Stories of courage during the partition. She's driving home when she sees a man being heckled and threatened by a group of vigilantes. She stops the car, picks the man up, puts him into the car, and so there's amount of courage in her personal thing. And during this whole period, in addition to the court judgments that go against her, one of her close advisors, D.P. Dhatt, dies. He's a family friend. So you get an image of a woman under siege. I'm giving you all these factors, external and internal, and that's why I think the India story doesn't travel to other regions of the world, because here is a woman under siege. If at all I have to sort of liken it to a literary character, the name that comes to mind is Agamemnon's in Iphigenia's in Euripides' play, Iphigenia at Aulis. So those of you who may not be familiar with it, Agamemnon, the general, is told by the priests that the army is getting restless, nothing is happening, and the army is getting restless because the winds are not blowing. So the army cannot set sail on its campaigns. So the priests who are cunning tell him the wind will start blowing if you kill your daughter, your beloved daughter. So he has to choose between sacrificing his daughter and letting the army, or not sacrificing his daughter and having the army kill them anyway, because the army was going to revolt. So I think, I may be stretching the point, but there is a kind of, damned if you do and damned if you don't situation. So the lady is under siege. Now, why did she impose the emergency? She believed that by imposing the emergency, she would, in a sense, avert the crisis. She would be the sole authority who would be able to take all the policy decisions, and the crisis would blow over. But she had the legacy of her father, who was a parliamentarian, a constitutionalist. How could she impose the emergency? In a sense, betray her father. Now, she was a narcissist who believed that only she could solve the problem, because once the court gave judgments against her, she had two choices. Either she resigns and goes, or she stays and fights. But if she resigns, whom does she hand over power to? The nation is hurtling towards anarchy. There were only two people she could hand over power to. She could hand over power to Jagjeevan Ram, whom she didn't trust, because her intelligence told her he's already planning to take over from you. So if she handed over power to him, he wouldn't hand it back if she won the Supreme Court case that was pending. And Y.B. Chavan, who she didn't think was up to the task of dealing with the crisis. So there were just two names in her party who she could have handed over to. So her advisors told her, Madam, you don't have to, in a sense, I'm paraphrasing it, turn your back on your father, because the Constitution has a provision, 352, which allows you to constitutionally impose a state of emergency, a state of internal emergency, because it's consistent. In fact, I'm flagging this here for later discussion. The Constituent Assembly debates were very intense about whether that provision should be retained in the future Constitution. And one group of people said, but it's an invitation to tyrants to take over by keeping it there. So it's a colonial artifact that should not be there in the Constitution of a free India. Another group of people said, but what is this freedom if the nation collapses? They had just experienced partition, and therefore they argued for the continuation of the emergency. I've mentioned it in the book. So her advisors told her, you can continue, and you can be consistent with Nehru's parliamentary, because Nehru was actively involved in framing the constitution. But then why did she lift it? People have accused her of imposing the emergency to also, in a sense, not just do away with the political crisis, but also defend her son, who was a bit of a thug. And he was guilty of corruption and waywardness. But he advised her to, he was one of the group of advisors to tell her to impose it. Now, when his activities during the emergency started coming out, especially forced sterilization and demolition of houses to beautify the old city, what is called the Turkoman Gate, she was very troubled. This is what the biographers say. This is what the memoirs say. She was very troubled. And one fine day, she decided to lift the emergency in spite of her son and other advisors telling her not to lift it. So how do you explain these two decisions? And I very seriously, I mean, now take this world of arriving at a decision in a situation of uncertainty, arriving at a decision, you know, when you go to a coffee shop and you say, can I have a coffee? They'll say latte, black. I mean, you have to make a decision with so many choices, and it takes you time. Imagine if you're prime minister and you have to make a decision in such a turbulent world. I believe when she imposed it, she was able to align the interests of her father with the interests of her son. Right? When she lifted it, she had to choose the interests of her father over that of her son. I'm using these as short forms. It seems to you rather simplistic, but it's not. I mean, there are whole universes between the relationship of a daughter and a father and the relationship of a mother and a son. And as you know from ethical theory, I mean, when it comes down to the wrongdoings of a child, parents are much more lax in phoning up the police and saying my son has stolen a car. So if that is true for us, if the subjective is true for us, and I'm now, to sort of defend me, have to invoke Foucault and his interpretations of classical theater. I mean, you see his lectures at the University of Berkeley. Barnesia, where he's continuously talking about, the god Apollo, feeling guilty at the fact that the child is his, lies to the king when the king comes and says, where is my son Ion, in the play Ion. So if we concede the subjective world in our study of literature, in our study of film, in our study, why are we not willing to concede the subjective in the domain of social sciences? Because when it comes to social sciences, we keep the subjective out. That's yesterday's theories. It's all institution, it's all structure, it's all process. And the person somehow becomes an agent only in name. I'm trying to, in a sense, broaden it. I'm not trying to reject structure, institution. I'm just saying that to really get a fuller understanding of the present, we need to bring these in. And I believe the emergency allows us to do that. I believe the emergency, there were many lapses on Mrs. Gandhi's part. In no way should one diminish. In fact, that's the challenge I had when this argument kept emerging. Oh, you seem to be justifying the emergency. And I ask myself the question, when does explanation begin to read like justification? Why does explanation begin to look like justification? Is it that scholars unable to deal with inconvenient facts move from explanation to ideology? I think they do. And I'll end with that provocation. Thank you.